Hello everybody, my name is Noob and welcome back to another Borderlands 4 Amon the Forgeknight build video. This time around we're going to be looking at the Scourge skill tree, which is all about elemental damage, long range melee and ordnance damage. I say long range melee mainly because this build is about whipping, throwing shields and spears. For this build specifically, we're going to be looking at the Stormlance augment, which basically gives Amon throwable spears, but we'll get to that in a bit. But like I was saying before, this build and this tree in general is just focused about doing elemental damage. For this build specifically, we use the Stormlance augment as part of what it does, and you can see on the item card is it gives Amon the ability to prime enemies. So very similar to the cybernetic skill tree and the crucible action skill with the throwable axes, gives Amon the ability to prime and detonate enemies. This Stormlance augment basically emulates that same thing. So you throw a spear at an enemy, you can prime them and then detonate them to deal AoE damage and finish them off quickly to deal damage. The benefit of the Stormlance augment as well is that the throwable spears themselves deal ordnance damage, which obviously scales well if you have the right passive stats on your class mods and enhancements and all those sorts of things as well. But obviously we don't know what all that looks like. This build is completely theory based, so we don't entirely know how it's got to work, but this is just the idea I have in mind for this build specifically. So in terms of the skills that we pick up, for the trunk, we start with Scorched Kairos, which gives Amon increased ordnance damage and magazine size. Pretty straightforward, don't really need to explain why we want to be able to do more ordnance damage. By boosting this damage, we're boosting our Stormlance damage, so it just ties in nicely. We pick up Eternal, which gives Amon increased action skill duration and gun swap speed. The gun swap speed, it's a nice quality of life thing to have, but the main part of this skill is the action skill duration. So because Stormlance is a active action skill in that you're staying in this action skill throwing out spears, by maximizing the time you spend in that means that you could prime more enemies, which means you could detonate more enemies and just fuel that gameplay loop over and over again. We then pick up Machinist, which is a kill skill that gives Amon a percentage of ordnance cooldown on every kill that he gets, once again fueling that ordnance loop, so you can use Stormlance, use your ordnance and keep fueling that gameplay loop over and over. We then also pick up Bullet Hail. This gives Amon's gunshots a chance to ricochet as an elemental shard, dealing cryo damage. Now obviously ricochets are a lot of fun, you can do a lot of that sort of stuff in BL3, even Borderlands 2 as well with Gauge, and we all know how that turns out in terms of AoE mob clearing, works out really well. But there's a few synergies specifically with the Cryo tree that I'll talk about very shortly in the second branch. So we have that out of the way. One thing I forgot to mention is that we also pick up Tail of the Comet. Now, what this does is that whenever Amon deals ordnance damage, it gives a chance to apply Cryo status that deals Cryo dot for a duration, and because this is a status-based skill, it's affected by status application chance, passive stats that you get on things like enhancements and class mods and things like that. So this, alongside Bullet Hail, dealing Cryo damage, ties in nicely with Branch 2, which we'll talk about right now. And we pick up this passive stat or passive skill Icy Rage, which gives Amon cryo damage whenever you kill an enemy with cryo. And with cryo affinity, you get increased gun damage. So you can see this stacks up quite nicely in terms of giving you extra gun damage. And because we have skills like Bullet Hail and Tail of the Comet, where we're giving ourselves a chance to apply cryo to enemies through ricochets or ordnance damage, which we're going to be spamming a lot of, we could try and buff this up as much as possible and keep this stacks active as much as we can. We also pick up Winter's Kiss. This gives Amon the chance to consume Cryo Affinity every time you deal ordnance damage, and for every enemy nearby, you get a chance for each of those enemies nearby to spawn an elemental shard that deals cryo damage in that area. Once again, we're trying to stack the odds of freezing an enemy so we can get the bonuses of Cryo Affinity and increase our gun damage overall. We also pick up Age of Ice. Now this is an additional bonus skill that's very useful to have with a cryo based build, because this just gives Amon a flat damage increase to enemies and bosses that are frozen. And this is always a persistent skill that's going to be active, and because we're going to be freezing a lot of enemies through ricochets, ordnance damage, and just our general cryo affinity stacks, you can get these damage bonus applicable as much as we can. So that's for branch 2. The next branch we invest into is branch 3 obviously, and we do this so we can get shock affinity. So whenever you kill an enemy with shock damage, you gain a stack of shock affinity, and for every stack we have, we gain increased crit damage. Now I'll explain very shortly why this is going to be very useful, but as you can see on the card and the stacks you get per level that you invest in and stacks to 5, this adds up pretty nicely. We then put points into Blackout, which gives our ordnance damage a chance to critically hit and shock enemies when they do. That's going to be useful to either give chances to kill enemies with shock to get shock affinity, or if it doesn't, they die through cryo damage, which gives us cryo affinity as well. But because we're spamming this in a large area, there's a pretty good chance that enemies will die from both shock and cryo, depending on how densely packed the mobs are. And then we also talk about the augment. So I did show this off very early in this video, but just to reiterate what it does, gives Amon throwable spears that deal shock ordnance damage on impact, and by consuming the vengeance stacks as well, which you build up by staying in your action skill and taking damage, you can increase the damage dealt by Stormlance as well. Stormlance also primes enemies, which means that when you detonate them, they'll explode and deal damage to enemies, deal damage to themselves, but not nearby enemies. But nonetheless, because we're going to be priming a lot of enemies, because we have things that will do this and keep us in our action skill as much as possible, like Eternal, we're fueling this gameplay loop of spamming Stormlance, priming as many enemies as possible, and then detonating them, whether it be through crits or by using our Capstone. So Wrathfall is the Capstone for this build, and what it does is basically summons down a huge AoE sword that does damage in a massive area, and it always has a chance to critically hit. Now, because we also maxed out Thunderous Rage and giving us a chance to increase our crit damage, we're basically meaning that whenever this crits, we're increasing the crit damage off this skill overall as well. Now, I'm not sure how this scales, but it does say it does ordnance damage, so that's a good way to understand what the damage source is, but you can keep adding on to that through other gun damage and all these things as well, potentially melee as well, but this remains to be tested. But by using Wrathfall on these enemies, we're going to be able to detonate them because we're killing them while they're primed, causing explosions, finishing them off, and just clearing enemies on a mass scale. And then from points that we have left over, we put them into Smelter. Now this is a kill skill that gives Amon a percentage of forward skill cooldown rate, and once again just helps to get Stormlance back up and running as much as we can. So yeah, that's pretty much the skill tree in a nutshell. I'll also be including the written guide as well that I'm used Mobalytics for to write this up. So if videos aren't your thing, you can have a look at the written guide. But yeah, this is definitely another build that I'm going to be trying when the game comes out very soon. And once I test it all and see how it all works and get an understanding of what gear works best and what doesn't, I'll be posting an updated build video with gameplay and actual tested content to basically help you guys understand how this tree works and how this build can work overall. So yeah, that's pretty much it from me, and I'll see you guys soon again. Ciao.